everybody, welcome back to English 112. This is for our class for April 29th, where we are talking about poetry. Last class, we were trying to come up with a definition of poetry and talking about how difficult it is to come up with the specific definition of poetry, as well as talking about some of the ways that we could go about reading poetry. And I encouraged you to listen to the sounds of poems because they're very lyrical. And one of the things you can do with the poem is that you can dissect it and talk about the elements that comprise it, much like you can do the same with the sentence. That's called diagramming a sentence, when you determine the parts of speech in a sentence. Well, you can do the same thing with the poem. And much like your ability to do that with a sentence, it might be useful so that you can understand how the structures of grammar work. But ultimately, what's more important is the sentence itself. So if you're going to talk about the grammatical elements of a sentence, it needs to be related to the content of the sentence, and it needs to be related to the content and the themes of the work in which you are studying. So for instance, if you were talking about a short story and you identified that there were 3 pronouns in a sentence, that really wouldn't be very interesting. However, if you were to indicate that those pronouns are important in terms of the theme or the major issues that are being discussed in the story, because all of the pronouns are male pronouns and it's a very male-centric story, then perhaps there might be some relevance to the grammatical structure of the sentence and the actual thematic structures of the story itself. And it would be similar with poetry. While it's useful to know how a poem is constructed, you need to be able to do more than just identify its elements. You need to talk about how and why those elements would be important to the poem as a whole. So I wanted to talk about scanning a poem, because that's what it's called when you go through a poem and you look for its meter or you look for its beat. And on page 760 of our text, if you're using the edition that I had ordered, there is a poem entitled Waiting for the Storm by Timothy Steele, written in 1986. And that poem, if you were to look at it, looks a bit odd because you'll see accent marks and you will also see line divisions in a way that you wouldn't necessarily see in the actual poem itself. Those were added after the fact by a reader who actually scanned the poem so that they could determine things like accented and unaccented parts of sentences, and also determine the number of syllables in lines, which would determine the kind of beat in the line. So the poem itself reads, Waiting for the Storm. Breeze sent a wrinkling darkness across the bay. I knelt beneath an upturned boat, and moment by moment felt the sand at my feet grow colder, the damp air chill and spread. Then the first raindrops sounded on the hull above my head. Now, if you were to go through and see how this poem has been scanned, and you were to read it with all of the accented areas and with all of the syllable breaks, it would sound something like this. Breeze sent a wrinkling darkness across the bay. I knelt beneath an upturned boat, and moment by moment felt the sand at my feet grow colder, the damp air chill and spread. Then the first raindrop sounded on the hull above my head. So if you're going to scan that poem and you can tell that there is a certain beat or a certain rhythm, then you need to connect it to the actual poem itself. And this poem is about somebody who happens to be waiting for a storm, and they're talking about how they're at the bay and they are underneath an upturned boat, and they feel the sand grow colder and the damp air becomes chill, and then they feel the first raindrops on the hull above their head. So basically, the beat of the poem is supposed to mimic the sounds of the rain that you would hear on the upturned boat if you were underneath the upturned boat. And notice that the beat increases as the poem progresses to show that the rain is increasing in speed and ferocity. So this would be a good example of scanning a poem for its meter, and also talking about how that meter is significant to the actual poem itself. And you can do the same thing in terms of evaluating a poem and determine its rhyme. And we had talked a little bit about this at the beginning of the semester when we were talking about A Sorrowful Woman, about the rhyme scheme or the rhyme pattern. And you use letters of the alphabet to indicate a new rhyme. And you start with the letter A, and then you just work your way through the other letters of the alphabet. And you look at the last word of each line, and those are the words that you use in order to determine if there is a pattern of rhyme. So there's an example of that on page 777 in the edition of the text that I had ordered. And that poem is called Upon Julia's Clothes. And if you were to look at that poem, you would see that it also looks a bit odd because at the ending of the lines, you've got letters in italics, A's and B's. And those were not there in the original construction of the poem. Those were added in by a reader after the fact to indicate the rhymes. So the poem itself, which was written in 1648 by Robert Herrick, Upon Julia's Clothes. And I'll read the poem to you. When as in silks my Julia goes, then methinks how sweetly flows that liquefaction of her clothes. Next, when I cast mine eyes and see that brave vibration each way free, ah, how that glittering taketh me. So if we were to look at the last word of each line, the last word of the first line is goes, and the last word of the second rhyme is flows. And both of those words rhyme together, goes and flows. They would be represented by the first letter of the alphabet, A, because that's the first rhyme. And the third line ends with the word close, which also rhymes with goes and flows. So thus far, we've got a pattern of A, A, A. And then we've got a new stanza. We talked about how a stanza is much like a paragraph break when you are writing prose or complete sentences. And the next stanza ends with, or line 4 ends with the line C. Now C does not rhyme with goes, flows, and close, which means it's a new rhyme. We go to the next letter of the alphabet, so the letter after A is the letter B. And it just so happens that the line afterwards ends with the word free, and free rhymes with C, so we can have a repetition of B here in that rhyme. And the very last line is me, ends with that word me, which rhymes with free and C. So basically, we've got a pattern of rhyme where the first 3 letters rhyme, or the first 3 lines rhyme, A, and then the second 3 lines rhyme, B, B, B. And again, if we think about the content of this poem to try to talk about how that rhyme scheme is important, the first stanza is talking about the beauty of Julia in her clothes and the silk in which she wears. The second stanza talks about Julia nude without those clothes. And we basically have a change in state from clothed to unclothed, which could be illustrated by the change in rhyme from rhyme A, which is clothed, to the next stage, which is B, which is unclothed. So in other words, if you can find a way to connect something like the rhyme or the meter to what's happening within the poem, certainly talk about it. But if you can't find a direct connection, then it's not worth talking about, just like it wouldn't be worth talking about in Young Goodman Brown that we have 2 nouns and 5 verbs, let's say, in the first sentence, unless you can find a way to connect that to what's happening within the text itself. Now, on page 627 of the edition that I had ordered, there's some suggestions for writing about poetry that you might want to consider as you are thinking about poetry. Again, you will be writing a journal at the ending of our poetry section when you are going to be selecting 3 of the poems from the poetry that we've read and write approximately a page or so in response. And then the final examination will give you an opportunity to choose some poems within a list that I will be providing you, a shortened list of the poems that we've discussed in class. And I'll ask you to select 2 and to respond to those poems. So these suggestions about writing about poetry can be suggestions that you can consider for your journal or also for the final examination. So some of the suggestions they have are very similar to the sorts of suggestions we've had for writing about drama and also writing about short story. But the first is, who is the speaker, and is it possible to determine the speaker's age, sex, sensibilities, level of awareness, and values? Is the speaker addressing anybody in particular? How do you respond to the speaker, favorably, negatively, and why? And what is the situation of the poem? Number 4, is there a specific setting of time and place? 5, does reading the poem out loud help you understand it? 6, does a paraphrase reveal the basic purpose of the poem? As I suggested, you might want to try to put the poem in your own words to try for an initial understanding. 7, how is the title significant? 8, is the theme presented directly or indirectly? 9, do any allusions enrich the poem's meaning? 10, how does the diction or the use of language reveal the poem's meaning? Are there any words repeated or any words that have nuances to them that help you understand what might be happening in the poem? Are there any figures of speech used in the poem? Question 11. Are there objects, places, persons, events, or actions that have allegorical or symbolic meanings in the poem? 13, is irony used in the poem? 14, what is the tone of the poem? The feelings associated with the poem. What kind of poetic conventions are used within the poem? Are there sounds that are repeated, such as rhyme? Do the lines have a regular meter or pattern or beat to them? Does the poem's form or structure follow an established pattern? Is the language of the poem intense and concentrated? And I would say that that's probably the case of all the poems we'll be reading, which means that the poem warrants multiple readings and requires multiple readings. Did you enjoy the poem? Just the kind of question that doesn't necessarily have a right or wrong answer. Is there a particular critical approach that seems especially appropriate for this poem? How might biographical information about the author help to determine the poem's central concerns? How might historical information about the poem provide a useful context for interpretation? To what extent do your own experiences, values, beliefs, and assumptions inform your interpretation? What kinds of evidence from the poem are you focusing on to support your interpretation? And given that there are a variety of ways to interpret the poem, which one seems the most useful to you and why? So now we are actually beginning the poetry section as far as I'm concerned. And the first poem I wanted us to talk about is the Shakespearean sonnet, probably Shakespeare's most famous sonnet, Shall I Compare Thee to a Summer's Day? Now, we talked a little bit about William Shakespeare and about his dramas. Now, the drama houses during Shakespeare's times were oftentimes closed because of plague. So during those times when large groups couldn't gather, we think, or scholars believe, is when Shakespeare devoted his time to his sonnets. These were highly structured poems that have been divided up by scholars into two groups. The early set of sonnets that are thought to have been written to a young man, probably Shakespeare's patron, somebody that Shakespeare wanted to flatter and compliment. And then the later set of sonnets that are thought to have been written to what's known as a dark lady, a woman that had dark hair and dark eyes, almost like a Hermia from A Midsummer Night's Dream, that Shakespeare was at the very least infatuated with and at the very most was having an active affair with. So in terms of these particular sonnets, sometimes it's very obvious that the sonnet is written to a particular person. Sometimes the sonnet is so general that it could be applicable in a number of situations. And Shakespeare wrote over 100 of these sonnets, so there are quite a few of them. And I just wanted to focus on one sonnet. None of these sonnets were titled, by the way. So we refer to the sonnets by the first line, or we refer to it based on the number in which scholars have organized the sonnets in the early group and the later group of sonnets. So probably Shakespeare's most famous sonnet is Shall I Compare Thee to a Summer's Day? And you can see that what I'm doing now is that I'm adding links to the poetry. Most of these links come from the Poetry Foundation, which is a great website for the actual poems themselves. In the event that you aren't able to access the textbook, you can find just about all of these poems. Actually, I believe all of them online. So I'll be able to provide links for all of them as we get to that particular poem. And this poem is probably one of the most misread poems on the face of the planet. Shall I Compare Thee to a Summer's Day, written in 1609. And I wanted to read the poem to you, the sonnet to you, by William Shakespeare. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely and more temperate. Rough winds do shake the darling buds of May, and summer's lease hath all too short a date. Sometime too hot the eye of heaven shines, and often is his gold complexion dimmed, and every fair from fair sometime declines by chance, or nature's changing course untrimmed. But thy eternal summer shall not fade, nor lose possession of that fair thou owest, nor shall death brag thou wanderest in his shade, when in eternal lines to time thou growest. So long as men can breathe or eyes can see, so long lives this, and this gives life to thee. So first, a few points about the structure of Shakespearean sonnets. Shakespearean sonnets are 14 lines long. They're always 14 lines long. They follow a particular rhyme scheme or rhyme pattern, which is A, B, A, B, C, D, C, D, E, F, E, F, G, G. So in other words, day rhymes with may, temperate rhymes with date, shines rhymes with declines, dimmed rhymes with untrimmed, fade rhymes with shade, owest rhymes with growest. The last two lines will rhyme together, and that's known as a couplet. See and thee rhyme together. The last two lines are indented inward and serve almost like a concluding paragraph. They serve to give a climax or a conclusion to the sonnet as a whole. In addition to 14 lines, and in addition to having that rhyme scheme of A, B, C, D, C, D, E, F, G, G, they also follow iambic pentameter. In other words, a 10-syllable line. So there's a particular meter. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? And you can do that for all of the lines. It very much duplicates what you would hear with a heartbeat. And that's one of the reasons why scholars have thought that Shakespeare's writing is so powerful, is because it mimics the natural beat or pattern of within our own bodies with our hearts. They also have to be lofty enough, important enough in terms of subject matter to devote a poem to them. So the themes would be serious themes, things like love and aging and beauty and so forth. They wouldn't deal with the mundane or crass issues of the world. So those are the criteria that all 100 plus sonnets had to follow. This particular sonnet is in the early set of sonnets thought to have been written to a young man. And this is how this sonnet is misinterpreted, because many people read this sonnet and they assume that it's a love sonnet of a romantic nature to a female. Instead, at least according to scholars, this is in the early set of sonnets that are written to a young man to try to flatter or praise the young man. And they don't necessarily have any kind of sexual or romantic connotation to them. And when Shakespeare asks in the beginning, shall I compare thee? Thee means you. So we aren't given a specific gender here. To a summer's day, the idea that summer is supposed to be the height of the seasons and a day is supposed to be the height of time. So basically a summer's day is the epitome of perfection. And then the rest of the poem goes to discuss how even though a summer's day is supposed to be perfect, it has its flaws. Saying that this person is more lovely, thou, meaning you, are more lovely and more temperate, more predictable than the summer. Why? This is the rest of the poem. Rough winds do shake the darling buds of May. So it can be windy in May, and those are shaking the early buds of flowers. And summer's lease hath all too short a date. In other words, summer doesn't last very long. It's quite finite, and it's quite short-lived. And I love the term lease. There isn't a sense of ownership here. The owner is God, or the owner is the natural world, not humanity. Sometime too hot the eye of heaven shines. And the eye of heaven would be basically the sun. And you might wonder, well, why didn't you just say sometimes the sun is too hot? Remember, we have to keep to the beat and the rhyme scheme as well. And often is his gold complexion dimmed, talking about the sun. And the sun is oftentimes referred to as a male form in literature. Basically, the sun can oftentimes be obscured by clouds. And every fair from fair sometimes declines. In other words, all beauty. So if you've ever heard mirror, mirror on the wall, who's the fairest one of all? This is in reference to beauty, not necessarily in reference to justice when we talk about fair. And every fair from fair sometimes declines. All beauty declines. By chance or nature's changing course untrimmed. So beauty declines either through a terrible accident, by chance, or nature's changing course untrimmed is aging. That ultimately beauty will experience descent. But thy eternal summer shall not fade. That this person has an eternal summer that will never fade. Nor lose possession of that fair thou owest, nor lose possession of that beauty thou possesses. When in eternal lines to time thou grow, nor shall death brag thou wanderest in his shade. In other words, death will never confront you. When in eternal lines to time thou growest, you will continue to live on through eternity. Now, this is an impossibility. We all have finite lifespans. So how can this be? This is where we get our last two lines. So long as men can breathe or eyes can see, so long lives this, and this gives life to thee. So basically, as long as there's someone breathing and seeing who can read the poem, so long lives this poem. And we aren't told this poem. We're just given the pronoun this. It's an unclear pronoun reference because we're given the pronoun without the noun that it's replacing. But if we were to add the pronoun, or if we were to add the noun to the pronoun, which of course if we did that, then that would basically hamper the iambic pentameter, the beat. But if we've got so long lives this, as long as this poem exists, this gives life to thee. The poem gives life to you. In other words, you can be immortalized through verse. Your memory can continue to live on through eternity as long as this poem exists and there's somebody who can read this particular poem. And as arrogant as it sounds, Shakespeare was right, because here we are in 2021 talking about this particular person. It also is rather subversive what Shakespeare is saying, because the idea is that there really is only one thing that can provide eternal life: God. Oh, and the poet, specifically Shakespeare, through his writing. So this is a good example of a sonnet, and we can see the structure of the sonnet, and also we get to see how Shakespeare, very typical of Shakespeare, will take the opportunity to be a business person, flatter somebody in a position of power and a position of money who can help to secure and protect Shakespeare's career, and also an opportunity for Shakespeare to brag a little bit about his writing. If you got nothing else out of this poem, do remember that it is not a love poem written to a woman, even though it could be used in that particular situation. But the these and the thous make it broad enough that it could be applicable to any number of couplings and any number of situations, which I think makes the poem much stronger. So the other poem that I wanted to talk about for today is on page 647, and it is entitled To His Coy Mistress. And this is another kind of poetic writing. I wanted to introduce you to the sonnet, and no one did the sonnet better, basically, than Shakespeare when we talk about sonnets. But on 647, we get a poem entitled To His Coy Mistress. And this particular poem is an example of a kind of poetry entitled metaphysical poetry. And it was a poetry that was written shortly after the sonnets were in vogue. This particular poem is probably one of the best examples I know of metaphysical poems that use extreme exaggeration, that try to push boundaries as much as possible, to use wit, and to surprise the reader as much as possible. This was written in 1681, so we've got several decades after the sonnet was written, by Andrew Marvell. He was very famous in terms of writing metaphysical poetry. And what we're going to see in this poem is a three-part argument. It's almost like an essay with a beginning, a middle, and an end. And I wanted to read this poem out loud to you. It's not a particularly easy poem to understand, so you probably will need multiple rereadings. To His Coy Mistress, 1681, Andrew Marvell. Had we but world enough and time, this coyness, lady, were no crime. We would sit down and think which way to walk, and pass our long love's day. Thou by the Indian Ganges side should rubies find. I by the tide of Humber would complain. I would love you 10 years before the flood, and you should, if you please, refuse, till the conversion of the Jews. My vegetable love should grow vaster than empires, and more slow. 100 years should go to praise thine eyes, and on thy forehead gaze, 300 to adore each breast, but 30,000 to the rest. An age at least to every part, and the last age should show your heart. For, lady, you deserve this state, nor would I love at a lower rate. But at my back I always hear time's winged chariot hurrying near, and yonder all before us lie deserts of vast eternity. Thy beauty shall no more be found, nor in thy marble vault shall sound my echoing song. Then worms shall try thy long-preserved virginity, and your quaint honor turn to dust, and into ashes all my lust. The grave's a fine and private place, but none, I think, do there embrace. Now, therefore, while the youthful hue sits on thy skin like morning dew, and while thy willing soul transpires at every pore with instant fires, now let us sport us while we may, and now, like amorous birds of prey, rather at once our time devour than languish in his slow chapt power. Let us roll all our strength and all our sweetness up into one ball, and tear our pleasures with rough strife through the iron gates of life. Thus, though we cannot make our sun stand still, yet we could make him run. And you can see that the parts aren't separated by stanzas, but there's a slight indentation to indicate the new sections. And if we were going to paraphrase this particular argument or this particular poem, the first part is basically saying, if we had time, if we had limitless time, had we but world enough in time, this coyness lady, and coy meant to be shy, this coyness lady were no crime. And the word mistress at the time just meant an unmarried woman. It didn't necessarily mean somebody who was involved in an illicit affair the way it does today. So if there were unlimited time, this woman could be as shy as she wanted. And they could sit down and think which way to walk to pass our long love's day. So they could take hours contemplating where to take a walk. Thou by the Indian Ganges side should rubies find. She could go to India and look for rubies in the river. And I by the tide of Humber would complain. In other words, another river that is in England, and he could spend his time at that river and complain. I would love you 10 years before the flood. Flood is capitalized to reference the biblical flood of Noah. So I could love you before the biblical flood of Noah. So this would be way, way, way back in the past. And you should, if you please, refuse to the conversion of the Jews. You can continue to turn me down until all of the Jews of the world convert to Catholicism or Christianity. And of course, that probably will never happen. So we're talking about a long period of time. My vegetable love should grow vaster than empires and more slow. In other words, if I had the opportunity, I could take my time to love you. 100 years should go to praise thine eyes. Spending 100 years praising this woman's eyes. And on thy forehead gaze, 200 to adore each breast. So if you do the math, 200 for each breast, that's 400 years to adore a breast. And then 30,000 to adore the rest of her beauty. And age at least to every part. And the last age should show your heart. For lady, you deserve this state, nor would I love at a lower rate. So if we had eternity, I would spend eternity basically worshiping you. And now we have a small indent to indicate the second part of the argument. But at my back, I always hear time's winged chariot hurrying near. In other words, we have limited time. And notice how the pace of the poem picks up when the poem is talking about how time is limited. And yonder all before us lie deserts of vast eternity, or if you want to keep the rhyme, deserts of vast eternity. In other words, we need to move now while we're still alive before we die. Thy beauty shall no more be found, nor in thy marble vault shall sound my echoing song. So she would be in a marble vault if she was dead. In other words, you're not going to retain your beauty once you die. This poem is very much a carpe diem poem, which is a seize the day, live in the moment kind of idea. Live now because we are not guaranteed the future. Eventually you will die. And he continues on, and you have to wonder, is this really a way to woo a woman, which is what this poem is about? But of course, we know that metaphysical poetry is supposed to be very extreme. It's supposed to push boundaries, and definitely it pushes boundaries if we've got a love poem that is talking about corpses. And he goes on and says, worms shall try thy long-preserved virginity or virginity, and your quaint honor turn to dust, and into ashes all my lust. That if she retains her virginity upon death, that virginity will be taken by worms. So worms are used as a phallic symbol, burrowing themselves into her. Again, it's a very crude and crass image, something we would never see in a Shakespearean sonnet, but something that would be considered witty and pushing boundaries in the metaphysical world of poetry. The grave's a fine and private place, but none, I think, do there embrace. No one is going to show you physical affection and love when you are dead and a corpse. Then we've got another indent. This is the third part of the argument, the summary. Now, therefore, while the youthful hue sits on thy skin like morning dew, in other words, while you're young, and while thy willing soul transpires at every pore with instant fires, while you still have energy and lust, now let us sport us while we may. And I think there is this element of sport in the poem. We're not necessarily supposed to take it quite literally, I don't think. But the idea is, let us enjoy physicality while we're still alive. Now let us sport us while we may, and now like amorous birds of prey, rather at once our time devour than languish in a slow chat power. In other words, let us use time rather than have time use us. Let us roll our strength and all our sweetness up into one ball. In other words, let's have union and become one, physically. And tear our pleasures with rough strife through the iron gates of life. And usually we talk about the golden gates of heaven, but there are the iron gates of life. Let us enjoy the beauty and the paradise of the physical world while we can. Though we cannot make our sun stand still, in other words, we can't stop time, yet we will make him run. In other words, you'll give time a run for his money, so to speak. So you can also consider this poem in terms of some of the questions that appear after the poem. So you'll notice that first you're asked, do you think this Carpe Diem poem, which I suggested earlier, is hopelessly dated, or does it speak to our contemporary concerns? The second question says that the poem is divided into a three-part argument, which is what I was indicating. Lines 1 through 20, 21 through 32, and 33 through 46. Number 3, what is the speaker's tone in the first 20 lines? How much time would he spend adoring his mistress? Is he sincere? Does he expect his mistress to respond to these lines? After all, what we get is hyperbole in those first lines, extreme exaggeration. It's impossible to spend 30,000 years adoring her. Number 4, how does the speaker's tone change with lines 21? And this is where the speaker is saying that we don't have time, we have to live now. And what is his view of time? And how do you think the mistress would react to these lines, especially the lines about the tomb and losing her virginity to worms? 5, in the final lines of another poem that's also is a metaphysical poem, it talks about how it's urging individuals to go marry. There isn't any reference in this poem to go marry. There's just reference to consummate relationship without marriage, which we had talked about in Midsummer Night's Dream, how important it was during this time period for a woman to remain virginal during or before marriage, and if she wasn't, she would be considered damaged goods. So during the time of the Renaissance, it would be rather scandalous to suggest to a woman, much like this poem does, and the period after the Renaissance, that she should give up her virginity without marriage. But that's exactly what's happening in this poem. And then the last question or comment, the poem is sometimes read as a rigorous but simple celebration of flesh. Is there more to the theme than that? So what we've got here are two very different poems that I wanted to expose us to. And over the next several classes, we'll talk about other poems. I've put the poems mostly in chronological order so that you can see a progression. We start with poems from Britain and we end with poems from the United States. You can see that some of the poems I assigned are not included in the textbook in which I had ordered, or at least the edition of the textbook which I had ordered. So what I've done for those poems that are listed as handout poems is I've included the links for those poems, and you can see those poems and their links below, though I will also be including links for the other poems that are included in our textbook for the classes in which we are talking about those particular poems. So for today's attendance question, which would be due on Friday, the 30th of April, 10 a.m., which poem out of the two poems we discussed today do you prefer? Do you prefer Shall I Compare Thee to a Summer's Day, or do you prefer To His Coy Mistress? And why? Again, no right or wrong answer. I'm just curious to hear what your thinking is. I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. And next class, we will continue on with more poetry. Take care. Bye-bye.